We're going to look at a psalm together. So we're going to look at Psalm 78, and it's a longer psalm. So I think it would probably be helpful for you if you've got a Bible or something you want to pull it up and look at it in front of you to follow along. I think that'd be really helpful as we go through. We won't read all of it, but we're going to read several parts of it. In the Bibles in the pews there, it's on page 472, as long as all of them are the same as the one that I picked up. So that might get you in the ballpark at least. So Psalm 78, the introduction of it tells us the author. It says it's a psalm of Asaph. Who was that? That was Asaph was around when David was king, and he was appointed by David to sing and play music in worship and thanksgiving to the Lord. And it talks about him and mentions him in 1 Chronicles 16. So that's who wrote it. And it kind of gives us the idea that this was written as a song for God's people to come together and use as part of their worship. So it starts off in the first 3 verses. He starts out asking for his readers' attention and saying he's about to share a parable, or depending on what version you're reading, it could say something like a proverb or a riddle. But all of those words really capture the same meaning, that he's going to use a comparison. He's going to use an image or an example to shed light on another area of life that the worshiper would be experiencing. And he says, while these might be challenging to understand, in verse 3, he says that he's really not saying anything that's new, which is true, because what we see he shares is just a retelling of Israel's history, which isn't something uncommon. Maybe you can think of other psalms where you just get this kind of long telling of what Israel had happened to them at some point. A lot of times it's like the Exodus story or their time in the wilderness or something like that. So it's this history. And then he seems to emphasize that this information gets passed along. In verses 7 and 8, he gives kind of the reason why. He says that they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its heart and whose spirit was not faithful to God. You've probably heard the saying, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That idea that, like, if something happens and we don't learn anything from it, we're just going to do the same thing again. The idea is that this would be shared with other generations, that they could know and not repeat the same problems and failures that the previous had. That in Israel's failure to remember the works of God's deliverance and to keep his commandments, they repeatedly craved after other things, and they rebelled against God. And so he makes a point that their actions were actually an expression of their attitude, the attitude of their hearts, that their hearts were never set right before God. So he says they were a stubborn and rebellious generation. And because of that, because their hearts weren't prepared, they didn't keep his commandments. And so their hearts were never set right before God, and when testing came, their actions revealed that. Verses 9 through 11 says, the sons of Ephraim were archers equipped with bows, yet they turned back in the day of battle. They did not keep the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law. They forgot his deeds and his miracles that he had shown them. I think this kind of captures the heart of the psalm and its meaning. Like, it's this warning as well as this encouragement towards us remembering God's works and his word, that the people that this was written for, as well as us, that we would remember those, that we might walk faithfully through our lives, that we'd remember Jesus, God's ultimate work of redemption, and the word made flesh, and so walk faithfully in our own lives. So verse 12, he starts by reminding them about the Exodus story and their time in the wilderness. It says, he wrought wonders before their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made the waters stand up like a heap. Then he led them with a cloud by day and all the night with a light of fire. He split the rocks in the wilderness and gave them abundant drink like the ocean depths. He brought forth streams also from the rock and caused waters to run down like rivers. Yet they still continued to sin against him, to rebel against the Most High in the desert. And in their hearts they put God to the test by asking food according to their desire. You get a lot of language in this part where it talks about like cravings. They're physical cravings, but I think also they're spiritual cravings for things other than what God was giving them. Verse 19, then they spoke against God. They said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck the rock so that water gushed out, and streams were overflowing. Can he give bread also? Will he provide meat for his people? Therefore the Lord heard and was full of wrath, and a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also mounted against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his salvation. So this recap of the wilderness, and the word wilderness carries this meaning in some of the original language of this uncreated place, which contrasts with the created place, as this contrast with like the garden imagery, the Garden of Eden, the promised land where God was taking them. And so it's this dangerous, this hostile environment. It's a place that God is not bringing them to. It's not the destination, but it's a place that God wants to bring them through. A place of scarcity and hardship. And because the reason why is because they're not ready for the promised land. So God invites them into this place of challenge, of hardship, scarcity, where there's nowhere way for them to make it on their own. And the only thing for them to do really is to lean into God and to trust him, to trust his word, to cling to that, to trust in his presence and his generosity, the things that he's promised. And so it's this place and this season of purification for Moses and the Israelites as they're led by God. And then in the wilderness, as you read this retelling, you realize just how they really weren't ready for the promised land, to be brought back to this place like it was in the garden. The people continually cry out against Moses, and in doing so, they cry out against God. They rebel, and as it says, they crave for more. They always seem to want more, or something other than what God is giving them. And so it was with Jesus, that while he was performing miracles, healing people, teaching as one who had authority that was distinct and different from all the other teachers at that time, yet Pharisees and others still asked for more signs. In John 6, Jesus has just fed the 5,000, and he leaves that place, and they realize he's gone, so they chase him around the lake. And they get there, and they want bread, and he says, you're here because you're trying to satisfy your craving for bread. But I'm telling you, I'm the one who's going to satisfy the real cravings that you have. I'm the one that God sent to satisfy you. And he tells them in John 6:35, he says, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. So back to the psalm, verse 19 says, in their hearts they put God to the test by asking food according to their desire. And in verse 22, because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his salvation. And I think when we read particularly like the Exodus story and the time in the wilderness, like we can be pretty hard on them of like, man, come on, like you guys just got led out of Egypt. Like you saw all the things that God did, like what were you thinking? But I read it and it started to get me thinking, like, don't I do the same thing sometimes? Like, don't I expect or crave something more or something different in the experience of salvation that God has given me? Some kind of an experience or a prosperity that isn't there. And if God doesn't seem to be giving me that, I'm going to struggle to trust him to actually be giving me what's best. And not trusting him to obey what he's commanded, not preparing our hearts before him. As it says in verse 8, we can struggle to believe that he is actually giving us what's best and then to obey what he's commanded us. And so we take things into our own hands the same way that they did. That we see salvation And then that's exactly what they were experiencing. God leading them. God was saving them from slavery in Egypt. They were experiencing salvation. We see that the same way that they did, as God taking something away from us. That they had, it says that they said and thought like, oh, man, I wish we were back in Egypt, like back where we had all this food. We sat by pots of meat. We had leeks and melons and all this stuff. And God brought us out here into the wilderness to starve and die. Like, I wish we were back there. And so they saw it as God taking away from them, rather than seeing it as God giving them and giving us something so much better than what we ever had. And so I was just realizing how much I can find myself in the same way of thinking as they did. Like, why can't I have both what I left behind in Egypt as well as to follow the Lord? And I don't think that's uncommon. Hebrews 3 recounts the same time of Israel in the wilderness and uses that in a similar way to warn believers against the same kind of unbelief that they had. So Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 through 15 says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, but encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share in Christ if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the very end. As has just been said, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart as you did in the rebellion or in the wilderness." This kind of wilderness experience, thinking about that, also made me think about any kind of like DIY project you can get into. I don't know if anyone else, maybe it's fixing your own car or renovating your own home or something like that. Just like the whole experience of being in the wilderness and what that's like and how we can relate to that. Like, you get some project. The latest for me was fixing my car last night in my garage. And you know, something needs to be done and you realize like, well, maybe I could do that myself. And you look at some YouTube videos or something or talk to somebody and you think, they made that look really easy. Like, I could probably pull that off and I'd save some money in the process. Like, I can do this. And so you get the stuff and you feel like you know what you're doing, you're confident, you're ready to go. And then you get started and you realize like, it's not quite the same as I saw in the video. And I don't really know what to do about that part. And he made it look really easy, but I'm not having such a good time here. And I think eventually there's been many a times I've been laid out on my back underneath the car, looking up, just thinking like, I don't know if I can do this. Or like, I don't want to finish this. And I think that's spiritually like what the wilderness feels like too. Like, we just feel stuck in over our heads. But I think when things get difficult, the only really thing to get us through those is to just keep moving. Like, we can think about how bad it seems. We can think about how it's not what we expect, how we wish it was different, how we wish we never started, how we wish it was just over. But when it comes down to it, the only thing that's going to get us through those difficulties, those tests, those trials, is to just keep moving. And I think it's the same in our spiritual lives. When things get tough, we just have to keep going. That Hebrews passage says, "For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast to the beginning of our assurance, firm until the end." That we don't forget the vision from when the project started. That we don't forget the promise that God has given us of his salvation, of his deliverance. That we don't forget the wonder of his word that he's given us. The same as it said in verse 5 of Psalm 78. That he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel. That God is setting his affection on you the same way he did Jacob and the people of Israel. When I find myself buried in some kind of project that I took on that maybe I shouldn't have, I'm usually too cheap to call someone and have them take care of whatever mess I made. But the one thing I have been known to do is to call a friend and have them join me in the mess that I made. And I think there's a little bit of wisdom in that maybe, that it's same in our spiritual lives. Each one of us is the one who's responsible. We have our own relationship with God. No one else can have that for us. Not our leadership, not our parents, not our children. That's ours. But that's not to say that we don't have an influence on one another. And I think that's why Hebrews 3 says, "But encourage one another day after day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." That in the middle of some daunting project or a tough spot spiritually, I don't think there's anything more encouraging than someone else that joins us in that. And I think the crazy part of it is that they don't really even have to do anything. Just having them there makes all the difference in the world. Like when you're turning a wrench, like only one person can do that at a time. Like hopefully that's the way it goes. But just having someone there for the moral support, someone there to be with you, it makes even the most difficult experiences somewhat joyful. So in the end, back to Psalm 78. In the end, the wilderness didn't really work to purify God's people. That even in their repentance, it says there was insincerity and their hearts weren't right. Verses 35 through 38 says, "And they remembered that God was their rock and the Most High God their Redeemer. But they deceived him with their mouth, and they lied to him with their tongue. For their heart was not steadfast toward him, nor were they faithful in his covenant. But he, being compassionate, forgave their iniquity and did not destroy them. And often he restrained his anger and did not arouse all his wrath. But yet, as we read on, God in his mercy still brought them to the place that he had promised them." Verses 52 through 56. "But he led forth his own people like sheep, and he guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them safely so that they did not fear. But the sea engulfed their enemies, so that he brought them to his holy land, to his hill country, which his right hand had gained. He also drove out the nations before them and apportioned them for an inheritance by measure, and made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. Yet they tempted and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his commandments." And then the psalm wraps up in the last few verses, talking more specifically about a new shepherd leader that their hope was to be found in at this point in time. The shepherd leader in David, who would lead his people the way Moses did through their present wilderness, testing and refinement, and be the leader that would restrain the craving that God's people had for rebellion. That seems to be where the psalm lands us, of like, thank God that we have this new shepherd leader in David. But we all know how David's story ends up. Ultimately, he didn't accomplish this thing that they expected. That David too rebelled. He tested God and succumbed to his own cravings. And his failures proved that no leader in Israel's history has ever been enough to restrain his people from testing God and following their own appetites. So we're kind of left with this question of like, okay, if David wasn't it, then who is this leader that's going to be able to restrain the cravings for rebellion that God's people has? And so Ezekiel 34 talks about the shepherds of Israel, the leadership at that time, and how they were corrupt and they weren't leading the people in a way that was just. And God says in that passage, in that chapter, talks about himself coming to be the new shepherd and then appointing one to lead the sheep. And so Jesus comes, and it says that he has compassion because the people are like sheep without a shepherd, and says, "I am the true bread from heaven. I'm what you're seeking and what's going to satisfy you." And announces, "I am the good shepherd." That this psalm actually points us towards Jesus and the accomplishment that he made in being the one that could lead his people and curb their cravings for rebellion and change their hearts. How does Jesus do that? How does Jesus control the craving for rebellion in us? He does that through love, that he rearranges our hearts and our affections. It says that we love because he first loved us, and that we love him if we obey his commandments. That we have a love problem more than an obedience problem. I talk to college students a lot, so I often say, like, you never have to have someone tell you to make sure you play your video games every day. Or maybe that's different for each one of us. You don't have to tell, we don't have to be told to watch our favorite sports team or do something like that. And why not? Well, because we love doing that. That we do the things that we love. We pursue and follow the things that we love. And we need Christ to put right our hearts that we might follow him out of love. So, while this psalm seems to end with David, I think it's just as much an urging us to turn our attention to Jesus, to hold fast to the hope that he offers us and that he's given us, that he's passed through the wilderness himself, and he's the one who's going to bring us through ours as well, and that we don't lose sight of the God who brought us to the place we're in right now and is going to bring us through as we continue to follow him. I think that's, the worship team can come back up. I think that's where this psalm lands us. An encouragement to continue following Jesus, to keep moving even in the difficult times that we face. So, yeah, we're going to end with a song, and then I will close us in prayer after.